Shakespeare. Here's chapter 5 of volume 1 of The Second Son. Second Son, volumes 1 and 2. Shakespeare. Chapter 5. The docks of Khufu were foul with the smell of rotting baitfish left in the sun. Captain Villara had not visited the port since she was young, always directed to assist her father as she commanded his own regional fleet preceding his promotion to admiral. And while her presence during discussions of military strategy were welcomed, her father often suggested she spend quality time with her older brother Finnegan, who was reliably playing nearby and vulnerable to bouts of loneliness and melancholy. To captain a vessel, she thought, meant the sum of her strength should be devoted to her crew and to refining her skills as a naval tactician. It brought to her mind the children awaiting her explanation below deck, and how even a lifetime of experience could not prepare them to make the decision she was about to impose. She left her cabin armed with an axe and a sword at her hips. The children turned to face her as her feet touched the stairs, and they creaked under her weight. "Follow me, all of you." She then returned to above deck. Sinmo and Harker escorted the children to follow. "You're not going to make us go back, are you? What did we do?" Ramilia said in Khufu, his voice cracking, and the infection of terror appearing on the faces of the others. "It's okay, the captain will explain everything in a moment," Harker offered, but his uncertainty was detected by Sol, who stood behind the smaller kids and corralled some of them in her arms to hopelessly shield their hearts with her embrace. It was midday, and the sun blinded their advance. When they could finally see again, they looked out over the familiar city, but nearly all were possessed by such dread that Sinmo nearly wept at the sight of their young, pale faces and evident tremble. The crew was not permitted to intervene nor influence any potential recruit in their decision to join Odin's military, and so they stood by silently as the captain addressed them. "If you choose to join, you will not find peace from your troubles, from those betrayals, and only more might find you, to see you to your doom. You have a day to decide whether you will remain here or join us. We sail at dawn. If you're on this ship, your new government assumes the preservation of your health, your mind, your spirit, and your future. In return, you will live what is sometimes a hard life at sea. Harker has been commissioned to provide you an education. Following adequate instruction, you'll be member to Odin's nation and military, to the Volsung clan, the Ravensword, and your captain. However, you may also choose to stay here and make your own way, and live under no such obligation." Harker finished translating, and the children remained motionless, impossibly confused by her formal commandments. The two caretakers felt her speech was so deprived of poetry. However, they were little encouraged the children would be inspired to useful patriotism. They studied their reactions for some discernible intent, and were pleased when some of the children sighed in relief. Captain Villara peered at them once more, and then returned to her quarters. Harker and Sinmo guided the younger kids below deck. The older ones stayed and watched the familiar dock workers and the ships coming and going. Firo approached Sol and Syrian. "I don't know if I told you, but I had to leave my home." "What happened?" Sol asked, performing the labor of translation 4 times over for each sentence exchanged. "I don't figure you know much about Victorious," he sighed uneasily and went on. "I tried over and again to diagnose my society, to destroy the cancer of prejudice against those from the territories. I've seen... It was so many sins. Sinful, hateful. Everyone I knew would assert this commandment or that injustice, would surely call manna or ruin from heaven. That's what did it. That's where we failed, they'd say." Half his nose scrambled in disgust from his utterances. "But it aren't like that. Ramilia's fight began a long time ago, with whispers and scowls. Civility sought suicide." Sol was old enough to recall memories of the insurrection in Khufu that ended with everyone that participated condemned in a mass execution. Her father convinced her they deserved the punishment, but upon witnessing their destruction, The crowd heckled the executioner and his accomplice. The representative of the court verifying the sentence was being carried out. The audience cast rotted food at them in a show of disobedience. The pair whipped their hands up to shield their faces and scrambled from the platform amidst the hanging bodies. The guards were also compelled to retreat to the nobles' district, where they were secured by 2 iron doors weighing several thousand pounds, and requiring the operation of a special mechanism to manipulate. Firo flicked the inner part of his ear. It seemed to happen all at once. We heard their rage and the screams and the burning amidst the rain, and then we saw them beyond the red gates to the Emperor's Plaza. They were already in the capital behind the walls before she even breached the gates. The rebels and everyone armed and sympathetic to them. They knew every secret passageway, every street, every back alley. There was nowhere to hide. Everyone in the city was judged by their peers, their friends, their neighbors, their bakers, He scratched at his beard nervously. The day of the attack, those highest in command, those preserved and kept by the black iron and stone of the palace, they wouldn't or didn't endorse our retreat, even knowing for certain we would soon be overwhelmed. Myself and my unit of 150 troops were meant to flank the rebels as they approached the gate, slowing them so that the conceited lords who remained behind might be able to escape. I refused them, however, because it would have meant certain death for me and those in my command. I blew the horn to call the retreat, and whoever was left made their escape with us into the hills. All the villages surrounding the capital swam in the same river of wrath, leaving whoever was victorious to claim for their allegiance. Eventually, Vermilia claimed all the territory north of the major river in Wulu, the Dolaman. He took a drink and kept on solemnly, and that's where things pretty much are. I've been on the run ever since. Where did you go? She asked, wondering now with the aid of an education how the gods wrought the land surrounding Victorious. Into hiding. I lived with my Sergeant Stilmaro for a time in a small cabin in the mountains. He doesn't talk much, he's lousy company. Firo said, smiling at the memory of the bald bastard, and silently wishing him good fortune. You talk a lot, she laughed, and perceived his accent was inconsistent with the modest grace of nobility. Well, he exclaimed, flinging his hands into the air. But Captain Valara left her quarters, bearing a small roll of parchment in her right hand, and approached Firo. I want you to get everything on this list, so you can show him where he can buy these things. Aye, Captain. They responded in concert as she threw Firo a sack of gold before departing. All right, he started, folding the scroll and slipping it into his pocket. We're going to a pub first, because it will make the rest of this tolerable. I don't want to be seen, she pleaded, scanning the crowd walking on the pier for faces familiar and threatening. Firo retrieved his cloak with a hood and donned her with it, adjusting it hid her completely from view. Better? She stated positively upon discovering her reflection in the water. Better. The pair left the ship and headed down the docks towards the city. A pub that would certainly be filled to capacity with foreigners was only a short way past the last pier. It was a gloomy establishment, with a stench coming from the alleyway, and it was quite dark inside due to an absence of windows. There were candles and torches positioned evenly upon the wall at eye level and offered little in their service. A minority of the patients ensured the air was clogged with tobacco smoke as they drank, but Sol found its odor to be pleasurable and calming. The room was square-shaped, with 4 pillars distributed to support the second floor, presumably where the bar's owner lived, and the aged wooden tables were large enough to accommodate 4 people comfortably. Firo approached the bartender and ordered 2 drinks. Laughter broke out as one man struck another in the face and sent him to the floor unconscious. Sol turned away from the spectacle and examined her liquor before smelling it, causing her to thrust it away from her face in disgust before addressing her comrade. Why do you drink that? Amused at her reluctance, he stole her mug and drank its contents before she could protest. Hey! She shouted, and placed her open palm in his face forcefully as she eyed the bag of gold. He chuckled, dropping several small coins in her hand, and the bartender awaited her when she came near. The mugs were filled again, and Sol gulped hers down before returning and spent the remaining money on another. Only 5 minutes had passed since they entered, and Sol was drunk and laughing at thin air, or so it seemed to Firo. He stood up, pleased that she seemed so at ease, but still bearing an anguish so acutely felt. No number of substances could help her to forget her woes completely. He instructed with gentle application, "All right, that's enough. Let's go." The merchant's district was located near the pub, so they did not go far before Sol turned into a shop and spoke with a man in Khufu about some of the contents on their list. It was a small front room connected to a large storeroom behind him. The man did not smile, nor look at them, nor talk very much, except to take the list and read it off to confirm what he would be able to fulfill for them. He was a bald man with a great big brown mustache. Sol knew his name was Ildar, and he had a wife who was very quiet named Elda. They came to Khufu as refugees from a territory controlled by Wulu called Gilda. It was one of the first countries invaded by the Empire because of its proximity, and it regulated the waterway used by ships for a much shorter trade route when traveling from the Bay of Greed to the Grey Sea. Ildar attempted to glimpse under the hood because he speculated she must be native to Khufu by her accent. His attention was diverted, however, when Firo showed him the gold. The man bounced them upon the counter and then took one and bit into it. He glanced at it once more, and, satisfied, he dropped them into his pocket and said, "What name should I put on the order?" Sol turned to Firo and asked, "What is your name?" "Firo Dintante," he answered towards Ildar before explaining where the ship was docked. "Thank you," the shopkeeper said in common, and he printed the name in a book. With business concluded, they exited the shop, and Sol looked over the list as she walked down the street. She glanced up for a moment, and her eyes enlarged as she hid behind the stacked barrels in front of an inn. Her breath abandoned her as she sank into a shadow, and held her knees to her chest, bracing herself for some imminent catastrophe. Firo followed suit, and vanished with her. "What are we hiding from?" he asked, peeking around the corner at the passers-by. Great darkening clouds amassed overhead and lingered with the weight of rain thwarting the wind from its mission of dispersion. Sol felt the soggy chill and knew they should locate shelter before the storm began. She spoke, haunted by a sense of dreadful haste. "I see my papa." Scene 2. Firo possessed few useful tools in consoling a child deliberately sold into slavery by her parents. But despite this, he attempted to extinguish her doubt. "You think he'd be able to recognize you with all this on? Maybe walk with a limp and hunch a little so he don't know it's you." Some of his words were still foreign to her, resulting in an expression of bewilderment. And so he pantomimed a person with a wilted leg, and she imitated his movements. Once she had nearly perfected the illusion of injury. Firo once again searched the market square ahead. "Okay, I'll let you know when he's gone. Which one is he?" "He's tall, with gray hair and a red shirt." The appearance of his perpetrator unseated his assumptions, as the man was rather ordinary while he was waylaid by indecision for the foods in the marketplace. He was elderly and shuffling in front of the impatient merchants seeking to peddle their wares before the rain chased them indoors. "He's old, your father. Much older than I am," Firo observed, retreating to the shade and studying the sky as thunder followed the lightning. "You both look old to me," she admitted, chuckling at him and his repulsion at the notion he was so soured by time. "See if I help you, you keep on with that," he answered, trying to impress his seriousness upon her, but secretly reveling in the joy of being harmlessly teased. Sol reminisced on her unpleasant family history and explained, "He had another family before he met my mother. His children grew up, but his wife died, so he met my mom, got married, and they had me and my brother." Firo thought of his own parents, and how accomplished his father was, and how his mother lamented her son's lack of ambition in court. He was well regarded as a fighter, but his philosophies were disagreeable to the nobles of Wulu, and he spent most of his time amongst the impoverished lightly gambling and heavily drinking. He fraternized with his troops, and was captured along with them when they broke into a storeroom to steal wine, liquor, and food. His position as an officer protected him and his accomplices, Therefore, he often talked them out of trouble when they were inclined to find some. He would later discover his personality was perfectly tailored for a life serving the Odinites. "He's still looking," the former knight updated her. Sol was quiet for so long, Firo turned back to find her weeping silently with her face in her knees, and her arms wrapped around them in cheerless reflection. "I know why my parents sold me," she began, and her voice quivered. "They knew I'd never marry because of the way I look. They'd never be rid of me, just like my brother." "Oh, come now, that's not why," he shot back. But he knew her reality was immune to any platitudes he could submit, and he went on. "Your parents are shits, is all." He squatted beside her and touched her shoulder gently, then patted rhythmically as she cried. She hugged him after a moment. Her crying turned to smothered sobs in his arms. "It'll be all right." And the solace he offered waned when he noticed his clothes. "Now stop that, you're getting your drippings all over my shirt." She laughed in spite of her grief and wiped her face clean. Firo smiled warmly and stepped away to search the square once more. "It's clear. Let's go." She composed herself and followed him through the streets. But as she hunted her father, she transformed into a creature of violence and retribution, surrendering to a whirlwind of frenzy and hate that murdered her innocent disposition and brought her to scheming her parents' demise. "Follow me this way," she growled as she turned down an alley. He was aware of what had come over her, having delivered justice for many other children forsook to the same fate since he had served Captain Valara. He chased after her until she paused in a doorway peering out from behind the corner. She caught a glimpse of her progenitor once again, but it did not trigger her to shrink away. Instead, she stalked him as he made his way through the streets carrying baskets of food and a bit of meat cut into small pieces. Firo spoke up, trailing just behind her. "Where's he going?" "Home." And she left her cover to follow the sauntering villain, now smiling and greeting his neighbors as he ascended a set of stairs. Dispensing with caution and feeling woeful, she nearly revealed her presence when the miscreant finally stopped and opened a door to what appeared to be nothing more than a wooden shack. She could see a dog with stringy white hair hopping up his legs, and her father leaned over, dropped some of the meat on the ground, and the dog ate it spiritedly. "That's your dog? We can take him with us. I'm sure the captain wouldn't mind," Firo asked. "I've never seen it before." She could not dispel a sudden haze of hate. "Oh," he answered, and cursed himself for suggesting it. As she walked away, her father looked through the window at the back of her and saw Firo watching him. He smiled at the stranger, and Firo forced an awkward smile in return, then left to follow Sol. Once he caught up with her, he asked, "What's on your mind?" Her visage concerned him, as it bore anguish and rage, the necessary components for frank brutality. "Let's go get you a drink and settle your nerves," he suggested. She seemed partial to the idea, so she delivered them to a street near the city center where the pubs would operate. As they entered one called the Passengers' Pub, a reference to their service of foreigners, Sol ordered 2 drinks and seized the money from Firo to pay for them. She drank it immediately and ordered another before throwing it back. She requested one more, took the glass, and sat at a table in the corner. He lagged behind, unequipped to arrest her fury. He finished his drink and watched her spin the cup with her fingers. "What are you thinking about?" he inquired gloomily, but knowingly. "Nothing," she answered with subtle invitation. "No, it's not nothing. I've seen that look before," Firo began, regarding the pretender with skepticism as the liquor fed her collar. "You're not the first kids we've saved from a jam like yours, and a lot of them had parents like yours. There's lots of folks like them out in the world. You can't kill them all. Believe me, we've tried. The captain has, anyway." Sol's presence in the exchange was merely physical, as notions of vengeance consumed her. She seemed to stare through the earth itself as she examined the contents remaining in her mug before she asked abruptly, "Are you going to help me, or not?" Firo sighed, snatching the cup from her and drank it. "Yeah, I'll help you, God's damn it." Giving voice to her darkest impulses awarded her a feeling of peace, and Firo empathized with her desire for revenge. He watched the rain falling thickly for a moment before saying, "The sun sets in an hour. The rain should keep on for a little while. Let's get to what's left on the list and we'll go after that. You will follow my every instruction, though. I aren't getting caught for this." Upon leaving, the downpour cleansed her of uncertainty as she strolled those familiar streets renewed in purpose and personal dignity. Her fingertips fondled the hilt of the dagger at her waist as they approached the ship just as night had fallen. The shops they patronized were delivering the supplies and placing them in the hold of the Raven's Word. "Keep this whole affair to yourself or I'll whack you," Firo ordered with an impotent finger held to her face. Sol would agree to anything if it ensured her plans could proceed, eluding anyone keen on thwarting her aims. As the sun disappeared, so too did the din of economy in action. The rain drove everyone indoors early, and she observed the workers from other ships and shops scrambling to shield their dry cargo from the storm. Sol slipped a finger along the blade and sharpened it poorly, however certain she would overcome any deficit to bring the knife to its function. Firo retrieved her, armed with a long dagger housed in a forest green sheath on his belt. She left Syrian to sleep on the boat as she returned to their old neighborhood with the former knight guiding their advance. The boy was unaware of her intentions, and she preferred it this way, as she knew he might interfere in an effort to save her from a society that heavily punishes patricide for reasons that had become quite plain to her. The blackness was gathered at the edge of the torch lights installed throughout the streets alongside burning braziers, illuminating the ground around them. The guards' presence in most districts was minimal, save those that housed the wealthy of Khufu. They were segregated from the rest of the city by a 20-foot-high wall of sandstone, and a single entrance with guards posted day and night. The only way in, other than the entrance, was a small space for water to drain from the wall. The guards occasionally chased animals and even children that had slipped through this way. The patrols did not take notice of them as they crept through the darkness, made whole by a feeble moon towards Sol's house. However, she was immobilized by the sight of her home amidst her grim undertaking, and she succumbed to panic wheezing. Firo gripped her by the shoulder and thrust her into the cover of darkness. "You're gonna need to calm. You might as well be blowing this horn if you're gonna be going in there now." She examined her for spectators to her presence, and tried refreshing her spirits against the damp stone wall. The ambiance of the ocean and the gulls still awake on the beach shepherded her thoughts to her joyless youth. The voices of patrons singing in a pub nearby reinvigorated her timorous disposition, and she hummed along. She was soon cured of doubt and married to her plan, leaving the shrouded alleyway and starting towards her parents' home. The raindrops pelting the rooftops and cobblestone streets concealed their footsteps as they approached the door. Her forebears were creatures without the courage for new delights, and she exploited this reliable manifestation of anxiety. The dog lingered by the door as she approached, growled at the stranger, and shifted his head curiously at her scent when he discovered it was indistinguishable from his new home. Firo gripped her by the shoulder and meant to remove her, but she revealed a piece of meat she stashed away and tossed it through the window. The dog's nature betrayed his better judgment, and he devoured the meat as she climbed in. Once the meal was gone, the dog returned to his defensive posture and snarled, but in an instant she snatched him by the throat and slipped a knife into his chest as he bucked and twisted. He cried a final smothered whimper and then hanged still in her hand. She placed him on the ground gently and opened the door for Firo. He saw what she had done, but said nothing. The door to her parents' room swung ajar silently, revealing the slumbering occupants laying exposed and naked beneath a thin cotton blanket. Firo slithered to one side of the bed, and Sol the other. She stood over her father and watched him breathing in the dark while drawing her knife slowly. The few acts of kindness imparted by them paled to their late depraved conduct. She determined the unreliable affection they imparted to her was collateral for their evil, and it only enhanced her resolve as she judged her brother's morale might be mended by this vengeance. With all the strength in her free hand, she sealed her father's mouth and nose as she plunged the blade into his heart. Her mother awoke, her eyes wide in hatred and terror amidst her husband's cries, but Firo suffocated her with such vigor. She knew the same violence would soon be visited upon her. The only discernible sound was her muffled screams as Sol leapt and straddled her an instant before thrusting the blade into her mother's chest over and again. The Odinites surveyed the fresh corpses and wrenched her off the bed when she burst into fits of sobbing. "No, there's no time for that. We need to go, now," he ordered as he carried her from the room. He took her black cloak and wiped the evidence of their crimes from her face and arms until she was clean again. They snuck back to the ship without alerting anyone as the rain continued to fall. Sol's mind could not be restrained in its obsession for justice earned, and when she knew she was safe, she wept again. Firo spoke gently. "I know, it don't make you feel better, but it's over now." He cradled her until exhaustion settled in, carried her to a bed beside Syrian, and laid her to sleep. He pitied her for a spell, and then left to find Captain Valara awaiting him at the top of the stairs. Scene 3. "Captain, you're up late." He tugged his rain-drenched shirt from his chest, and stating it with such suspicion, she raised her brow at him. "Are you trying to become a wanted man at every port?" Captain Valara asked, crossing her arms as she waited a sensible explanation for their late venture onto the island. He sighed and hung his head in prostration. "I was trying to keep her out of trouble." "It's done? You weren't seen?" she rejoined with no trace of displeasure in her voice, which relieved the former knight more than not getting arrested by the city's authorities. "Yes, it's done, and no, I don't think so." "Good." She started towards her cabin and spoke briefly. "You both have extra duties for a month." The captain's mercy was not unnoticed as his thoughts turned to a girl named Bree, who joined the crew shortly after he did. 10 years of age, but was comprised of the remains of a much-abused soul. At 9, she was traded to be a wife by her stepmother for a failing stable in the archipelago of Troph in the Silo Ocean. Firo yearned to deliver her justice of a similar kind, but she cut her throat in despair once they departed and the deed had been done. He detected no such impulse in Sol, as she was tasked with caring for her invalid brother, a duty that might have stayed Bree's hand had she discovered her younger sister alive. He sat upright beside them as they lay there, ruminating and prepared to save her from herself, should she succumb to her sorrow. He sliced pieces of an apple and ate them as he listened to the sounds of the crew and children snoring. Harker and Sinmo, however, were a storm of cheer and beer, exchanging sentimental notions as they drank together in a pub nearby. The teacher was counting his drinks aloud in 13 languages, but lacking the cooperation of his tongue while he uttered drunkenly, "The children that remain, I want to remain in our care. I'd like you to come on officially as my assistant in educating them." Sinmo had suffered flattery before, but Harker's proposition elevated their discourse to previously unknown heights of confidence and trust between them. Accustomed to new alliances, due to regular application of the Odinites' recruitment methods, he negotiated with his new companion. "We are partners or nothing at all." "I accept your terms. We'll be partners." Harker forfeited immediately and christened their agreement with a toast. They followed this exchange, discussing the shameless manipulation children would employ for their own benefit, having not yet learned that such tactics were inconsistent with those of strong moral and ethical character. Sinmo spoke at length of the many kids brought aboard the Ravensward that would later become exceptional sailors under the tutelage of Dizas, Miro, and Captain Valara. They were grateful they shared identical philosophies on the rearing of their students, and planned their instruction eagerly. However, the rum Harker and Sinmo consumed would render their brains incapable of retaining any portion of their ambitions. Harker felt a pang in his heart as he saw the thread between Sinmo's compassion and the loss of his children to the vial. The instructor realized his convictions were shielded by the aegis of God, noting any violence upon the spirits of their salvaged posterity should only mean battery of their trespassers. The old man brushed his beard uniformly and grieved. "I miss them every day, and sometimes I see them in a crowd, though it is not but an evil ghost in my sad eye." The Reverian reflected earnestly, hoping some departure from platitudes, often issued by the indifferent, would inspire true consolation in his new friend. "I don't know if I want to have children, 'cause I'm afraid to learn what it's like to lose them. This world has birthed cruel broods," he caught himself before tumbling to the ground from his bar seat. "It's still worth it," Senmo said confidently. "Even for a little bit of time you get with him. I wouldn't change a thing about my life except to have my children live on instead of me." "Then these kids will be without you," Harker reminded him, while using the remainder of his attention for staying upright. "They will have you, which is just as good," Senmo shot back with an air of competitive adulation. "That's kind of you," Harker replied, stumbling from his stool. "But it's time to sleep if we want to be up by dawn. I don't know which of them will stay or go. I'm quite sure Sol or Syrian will remain, but the others? I'm not so sure." Sinmo conceded the hour was late, and nodded as he stood. He gripped the counter with both hands as his eyes rolled independently of one another behind hooded lids, before his comrade conscripted him into the service of mutual stability, and they left the pub as an earnest image of friendship. The infestation of crab hypnotized Harker and Sinmo, as the pier seemed to squirm before them, and they confided in one another the fear of falling unconscious in the presence of such dependable vultures. Festival goers littered the ground with the rank debris, celebrating the creature's significance to Khufu's livelihood by boiling them in mass and discarding their fractured shells throughout the docks negligently. A scrimmage between species had emerged, and the pair observed the factions of the seas scavenge and cannibalize scraps too deeply situated for humans to harvest. Upon arrival, all the children were accounted for except for Kono, Bono, Rono, and Lono. After an exhaustive search of the Ravensward, the Revelian and his partner wept at their departure and silently wished them well before falling asleep in the neighboring hammocks. The four boys were half a mile into the city, returning to the scene of their kidnapping, and searching for the criminally amenable parties responsible for their imprisonment and enslavement. She was there, the perpetrator aged 7 years, and nearly 4 feet of peerless wickedness. Her hair was black, and it drooped unkempt in her face as she peeled a raw sweet onion and bit into it. She was unaware of her precarious circumstance as the boys advanced, hidden in shadows shaped by a failing sun, the four of them now neophytes of retribution. Their impression was she would make for a feeble foe, but no quarter could be given to those sharing in the profits of bondage, and so they armed themselves with their new blades and prepared to discourage future collaboration. She adjusted herself upon a blanket that was yellowed by use and neglect, inspecting the extent of the rot growing on her onion before consuming the edible remainder. Rono devised a plan, and the others listened intently as he suggested a plan to bear an agreeable end. Once each consented to their assignment, they paused and surveyed their surroundings there. Before rushing the girl in concert, her eyes widening at the dreaded realization her life would soon be subject to a compulsory end. She attempted to flee and deafened the boys with a shriek of horror, alerting her confederates awaiting her signal nearby. Without faltering, the four pounced at last, seizing her by the ankles and forcing her to the ground. She barked and flailed in the mud, her fingers plowing deep grooves as they dragged her towards them and stabbed her along the spine repeatedly until she went limp, their knives soiled by their vengeance brought to bear. Her hasty disposal had been the subject of much deliberation preceding her demise, but Kono, with increasingly characteristic nimbleness of thought, pointed to a nearby barrel, and her bloodied corpse was deposited inside, absent any propriety or ceremony. Bono gestured frantically. There was something that deserved their attention approaching. 2 familiar and starved bandits arrived equipped with a blade wider and certainly sturdier than their forearms, and investigating her final beseechments. Their search was brief, as her blood drained upon the platform, also supporting the weight of those 2 abandoned shacks, and revealing her location straight away. The men groaned at their misfortune, and rubbed the back of their necks in contemplation for a solution to the death of their most lucrative deception. One of the men indicated a report to their benefactor was in order, and they had nearly retrieved her petite remains, when Kono and Rono leapt onto the men, and exhausted their vigor, sending their knives through the flesh of their shoulders and chest, The cries first issued by them desisted as the second knife wielded by Bono and Lono penetrated the soft tissue of their genitals and stomach, actualizing their sentence advanced, and thus carrying it out. Her blanket was thoroughly desecrated as they shared in it the cleansing from their gore deluge. The city provided suitable refuge for the four boys while they scattered to avoid detection, until the bodies were discovered and disposed of by the guards. The ship imparted a sentimental reflex in the boys as they boarded the Ravenswood, once more with solemnity. They exchanged no pleasantries nor well wishes with the others as they packed what belongings they had accumulated while aboard, and the four of them muttered a prayer over their slumbering instructor and his elder compatriot. The entire crew was unaware of their departure, save for Captain Valara, who left her quarters as they ascended to the deck. Kono paused to say something in Khufu to his captain, and his comrades paid similar tribute, nodding in agreement. She did not understand a word of what he said, but she reckoned he was expressing gratitude. He extended his hand to the good captain, and she took it before declaring her an ally until the end of time. Then they left into the darkness, and she watched them disappear in a crowd upon the pier. As the boys found a warm place to sleep on the streets of Khufu, somewhat out of the elements, they clutched at their knives until they drifted off as dawn was approaching. Scene 4. Rum was the enemy of discipline, and the beverage had been consumed in such amounts that the crew suffered the casualty of their zeal. Harker, Sinmo, and dozens of others were thrown from their hammocks by a Herculean first mate driven by his own embarrassment for oversleeping and awakening with an amused captain standing over him. As they moaned for their fall injuries, they arrested their anger towards their superior officer and dressed themselves before they proceeded up the stairs to the deck. Sinmo inexplicably managed to stay asleep upon impact, the children noting the very slight bounce as his stomach reached the floor first. Harker was prepared to address the children when he noticed 4 of the hammocks were empty. He shook his colleague aggressively, and the old man sat up rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "The boys, they are gone," Harker lamented with tears kissing his cheeks as they fell. Sinmo's experiences with other children turning away service to Odin had poised him for disappointment of this immensity. He embraced the young man a moment before Romelia enveloped Harker's waist with his portly arms, and squeezed with a mightiness he found to be a useful quality to cement dominance amongst his peers. The instructor recoiled from the pain, but retained an effectual smile. "May the gods protect them," he said, massaging away the tenderness of his hips, and continued, "I'll prepare their learning materials while you feed them." The old man needed no further direction as he corralled the children to breakfast in the galley. The chef called herself Fritz, and was decidedly the most aloof personality aboard the Ravenswood. Captain Valara is the only person she has confided in, and for more than a decade her origins and ideologies remained a mystery to the rest of the crew. She was nearly a decade older than the captain at 72 summers, 49 of those being at sea. She was discovered by the Odinites in the employ of pirates, but the chef offered a prepared meal in place of a defense, and the captain immediately acquitted her of her crimes. Harker appeared in the galley and seated himself beside Sinmo at a wooden table and a stool bolted to the floor. His appetite was hampered by anxiety at the notion of the open ocean, and concern for the vessel to remain in good repair so it could bear them to the hell sea. The children suffered a physique unequipped to perform the most basic nautical maneuvers, and he suspected they were ignorant of their deficiencies and would endanger themselves in their first battle. Fritz relieved an itch on her grayed scalp with the wooden spoon before she stirred the potatoes, sizzling in a cast-iron pan. The aroma from the butter she had procured in the market the day before elicited hollers and pounding upon the table as the children commemorated the occasion with sincere enthusiasm. The plates distributed, Fritz planted herself at the edge of the kitchen, scowling with arms crossed, and shouting in an unknown language at any hesitancy to compliment her by unburdening their dish of any food. The ritual was a welcome one, and the kids were accustomed to falling silent once the plates were served. That day, however, diverged from the mundane when Captain Valara entered the room, as if hell itself were drawing ever nearer, and this tamed everyone's attention. Fritz mumbled in approval as the captain spoke, with Harker meekly providing the translation. "You are now all enlisted in the military forces of the nation of Odin. You will receive orders, and you will obey them. Your lives have now become exceedingly simple with this arrangement. Either by death or by my decree will you be released from your duty. Rocco will give you the details of what will be expected of you from this point forward. Prepare your mind to accept a death or life of valor. If you have any questions, direct them to him." She pointed at the first mate who had slipped in when she began. "Perhaps some of you may keep breathing long enough to see us take back our homeland. It's now yours as well." And the silence persisted after she departed. Their estimations of her authority over them was further corrected by Harker as he clarified the nature and consequences of their late commitment. Sol was only one presently mature enough to possess a realistic depiction of what they might endure so far out at sea, hundreds of miles from civilization or the rule of law. Her experience with this lifestyle was entirely derived from tales of a friend Syrian had named Steed, who arrived in Khufu 3 years before on a galleon, and they were of the same age, but he was tormented by a stutter. They found a kindred spirit in their common struggle and exchanged stories of their lives. Steed's father was an amiable conman that regarded confections with the same exaltation as his young son. Their friendship swept away the pain of their poverty, because children view wealth of candy as to be most supreme. Therefore, every visit with him meant a lemon drop from his father's pocket, and Syrian advanced the notion they should experiment the finest and most effective way to enjoy such a bounty while their summer of sugar lasted. The dozen or so trials yielded the universal realization that simply putting the candy in one's mouth whole prevailed over any other method of dissection or preparation. Having not discovered anything novel to tell the other children in the city, they returned to old games, until a dark day arrived, and all their shared joy was suspended indefinitely. Steed's father learned the nobility intended on arresting and prosecuting him for the sale of fraudulent merchandise from paradise, crimes unrelated to his suspiciously limitless supply of sweets. The boy and his father fled to the Midras Ocean, and Syrian watched his friend disappear in the galleon over the horizon, hopeless in the belief he would ever look upon him again. Syrian always finished his meal first with an urgency he could not explain, and so he awaited his sister to empty her plate before he spoke above the din of murmurs and snorts, still under the watchful eye of Fritz. "I heard you talking to Firo last night." Her brother's gaze did not leave her. An instinct for the duplicitous struck, a regrettable artifact from her flawed forebears. The impulse for deception inspired shame in her heart, that she could ever consider uttering falsehoods to her only loved one left. She held her breath as her mind turned to expressing the salient truth, but she could do no more than open her mouth and sigh. The rage that supplemented her courage before had abandoned her in the face of her brother, who she worried would bemoan their parents' violent end. Syrian, however, would mourn nothing of the kind. While only 12 summers in age, he decided with his meager stores of accumulated wisdom that curing his sister of her grief should supersede all his other aspirations. He held her hand and embraced her with his other. "It's all right," he whispered encouragingly, which provoked a fit of sobbing in them that they swore would be the last lamentations they would ever express for the loss of their parents again. The other children were envious of the siblings, save for Moon and Sky, who refrained from expressing any opinion in an intelligible language. Vodstock hugged Ramelia sitting beside him as if infected by a desire for affection, and made a great effort to touch his opposing fingertips together. However, the older boy's ample belly would render this an impossible task, and in response he thrust his hands down upon Vodstock's arms and chuckled, "Get off of me." Dear reader, children may be told no, but on occasion this must be done sternly, if they have a particular temperament, and are being too familiar with an acquaintance not prepared for horseplay. Ramelia committed the all-too-common misstep of offering the boy a laugh preceding his request, which Vodstock would consider consent, or even a solicitation for further tomfoolery. As he cackled at Ramelia's attempts to free himself, he became unaware of the attention he had garnered from everyone in the galley, and Fritz's glare alone was a powerless deterrent to this outburst. The other children warned him with raised voices to stop, and he immediately withdrew from the target of his torment, sinking deeply into his chair under the weight of the shift's unblinking scrutiny. Harker and Sinmo had arrived, having witnessed just enough of the spectacle to feel quite embarrassed in front of the chef. "They are waiting for us on the deck," Harker directed, and the children revealed a keenness to leave the galley by scrambling from their seats and through the doors, never daring to turn back to check if Fritz was still watching them. Figlio's presence just outside had the immediate effect of dispelling their anxiety, as all of the children crouched to apply a generous number of gentle head scratches. The cat meowed approvingly as Harker waded through them to retrieve him, and requested a portion of fish for the feline's breakfast after learning he had exhausted Figlio's stores of dried meat. Fritz obliged with an audible groan, and returned to him with one hand bearing the meal and the other outstretched with her palm upwards in a show of expected payment. The instructor was confounded, and gaped at Sinmo for an explanation. The old man plunged his hands into the pockets of his trousers, and disclosed, through a public accounting, some of his assets. After ascertaining the value of what he withdrew, he dropped 3 foreign coins of an unknown silvery metal into her palm, and she deposited them in a pouch hidden in her bosom before walking away. She does not consider Figlio a member of the crew. Therefore, any expenses incurred on his behalf are your responsibility. Ours, actually, the old man finished by kissing the cat on his cheek. Harker patted himself on the chest and pockets. I'll make you whole again once I have the opportunity to retrieve the money. Do not take offense to Fritz, Sinmo advised as they arrived at the main stairwell to the main deck. Everyone that's ever brought an animal companion aboard had to stomach the same policy. The young teacher was consoled enough to forget the incident when they discovered Rocco was inclined to instruct the children himself without the aid of translation, believing his many experiences of being socially coerced into complex pantomime, as a consequence of his deafness, would make him uniquely qualified to demonstrate to the recruits competent operation of the mainsail. To the children, the first mate was enormous, and at that juncture of their journey, they had yet to cross anyone who was comparable in size. Their impression of him was the work of a playful conspiracy by the veteran crew. They convinced many of the kids Rocco had once liberated the Ravensward from a shallow reef, when he single-handedly hauled it away by the anchor after their navigator inadvertently piloted them into it. Other exaggerations involving his strength were issued for the sake of frightening them into compliance, such as his rumored penchant for throwing layabouts into the sun. Whatever beliefs they held as true, they were sure no one aboard the ship had ever protested one of his commands, and so no challenge to prove the legends legitimate ever arose. The first mate exhibited no remorse expending his efforts in the ill-fated lecture. In fact, he appeared by all accounts to feel more contented than Harker ever had following his own instruction. However, this delusion of proficiency was perfectly repudiated when Vodstock was called upon by Sinmo to perform the task of furling the flying jib. The boy adjusted his mask in agitated gesture, but grasped the sheets in the same manner Rocco had shown them moments before. He failed spectacularly to imitate the undertaking any further than this. The following is attention I hold in little regard, but my experience has persuaded me that men and boys have an amusing propensity for occasionally committing violence upon uncooperative inanimate objects. Vodstock surrendered to this impulse, yanking on the sheets until he roared, and then clawed at the motionless sails with youth's abandon. Rocco's laughter at the senselessness of the boy was further kindling for his indignation, and Remilia intervened by dragging him from the sail, flailing and shouting curses at his inert foe. Scene 5. Harker surmised the first mate's appetite for any more lecturing had been sated, and he proposed, "Perhaps we can return below deck to our lessons?" Rocco waved them away with feigned indifference, and opened up to Ced, an Odinite from the homeland, but through time in his mind would fail to retain the finer details of the once venerated memories. Ced reflected on his creeping apathy regarding their long-expected return to Odin, but initially offered the first mate a fraction of his attention as he spoke. "I ain't keen on returning to that cold. I'm too used to being near the equator." Ced embraced his eagerness to talk candidly with him while they were alone, and his superior looked at his mouth carefully as he replied, "You can get used to anywhere in 4 years, and look at you. You haven't got a hair on your face or your body to shield you from the cold, that's why. You're like a newborn babe. It's all right, though. You've got your winter clothes packed away, yeah? Then no problem. We'll be sailing the Hell's Sea with junior sailors. We won't be the most intimidating ship in the fleet once we arrive. No, we will be mocked endlessly. These ones are younger than usual." "They wouldn't say anything to her face," Rocco assured him, recalling a prodigious fighter named Hatsuru that dethroned Valara Victor as the youngest captain in Odin's history. The prodigy served her for a decade before she recommended him to the military council to command his own vessel. But, some years preceding this promotion, and the policy of enlistment now applied by Odin's military everywhere, Captain Valara was subject to comments from skeptical members of the Congress, and she resolved their lack of faith with a contest of arms between her foreign disciple Hatsuru and a legionnaire grown on the mainland in peak fighting form from the infamous 41st Infantry. The duel ended in a draw, as both combatants had proved themselves indispensable to government aims, and the display had furnished the lawmakers with the certainty and political capital they required to pass legislation for the building of their armed forces with consenting and loyal foreigners. It became officially and affectionately known as the Kimba Prerogative, honoring Hatsuru's origins, and it empowered captains to recruit any willing applicant from any nation with deference to state security, and in exchange, the recruits would be compensated with land and citizenship. The former became an irony, though, as merchants from most nations began to joke amongst one another about ever receiving restitution for accepting land there as a trade. After a decade of Polmark's occupation had passed, it was common for a trader to lament a failed wager by prefacing her tale with, "I just got some land in Odin." Ced pondered on his history aboard the Ravensword. When the captain got her first command, we suffered a lot of mockery from the fleet when they saw Hatsuru and the rest. Now everyone has their own younglings and rejects from other countries. But I figure even if we kill every last Polmarks in Odin, we will simply be another army of foreigners come to take their promised land. And the culture that delivered us our just society will be corrupted and fall into decline if they don't learn to be as we are. Did it escape you that I'm a foreigner as well? Rocco inquired, not pleased with his comrade's assumptions, but considered Ced might be persuaded otherwise. We've been conquered. We'll be erased entirely without new blood, and the blood back home isn't meant to fight. The captain wouldn't ask them to rise up without the assurance of a military offensive. It shan't be spilled for nothing. When we arrive on our shores again, they'll be grateful to look upon the blue star on our sails regardless of who operates them. Wooloo was once a nation to envy, Ced began, understanding there would be no compensation to come in the form of consensus with his superior, but he felt he should caution him anyway. The first emperor's reign, Malivar Ordefon, were its most prosperous, and his daughter Muirta would conquer all of their neighbors and former allies until her son succeeded her, and allowed free movement between the territories and states. It polluted their population beyond repair. 2 generations later, the empire is shattered. Rebels like Remelia used their pedigree of foreign blood to inflame her people's grievances until the whole country went to shit. A lot of disagreement now about how things should be in North Wooloo. It's always been going to shit, Rocco shook his head at the dubious claims. Everything that happened was there before the rebels, they just weren't organized. I understand what you're saying, I do. But she's the fleet admiral's daughter. It sends a message that hasn't been useful to him in years. He doesn't seem any closer to committing our forces to liberate our home. Until he keels over and we have a new command, we'll be relegated to recruiting more expatriates and slaves. My parents were slaves, Rocco revealed as his collar soared, and he dreamt of casting him overboard. What's wrong with bringing them in? We've saved their lives. We know they'll be grateful and loyal. Ced was unconvinced by this contention, as his experience had yielded wisdom in this regard. I've met loads that see what we provide as just another kind of subjugation. After 15 years of occupation, we're still granting parcels of land that none will be able to claim while they're still alive. It seems to me a cruel joke to make such promises. The captain makes the offer in good faith, the first mate answered as the subject of their exchange left her cabin. Ced disappeared, worried that she had overheard his faithless assertions. Rocco was looking out on the horizon when Syrian yelled from below deck. Harker made every effort to infuse some theater in his lectures when discussing the particulars of history, as it might otherwise only be appreciated if one is sufficiently acquainted with the aforementioned to draw learned and comprehensive conclusions that stimulate the mind. The motives of those deemed worthy of documentation by historians are often more scandalous, compelling, and relatable to students, so he considered posing a question requiring an anecdote. How many of you have met an Odinite before you came to the Ravensword? He finished in common. Dara raised her hand meekly, and the others had heard her speak so seldomly. Her enlistment to reveal something of a personal nature was perceived by all as most curious. Tell us the tale, then, in common, if you can, Harker instructed as he leaned forward into the light shining through the window behind him. To Sinmo's astonishment, her society was convinced by the rehearsed affection of confidence she assumed before proceeding with her story. My brother Nix became friends with the daughter of an Odinite merchant, and they would spend their time together in secret. He would go into the night to see her. I followed them to a field and found them kissing without clothes in a dark grove, but she left a few days later and never came back. The last she uttered with remorse, a feeling and wisdom that flourished as she matured, and was made aware of the consequences of a romance abandoned. No such compulsion for affection enchanted her. Instead, she sought the comfort of knowledge and its accumulation. Harker was moved by her regret and thanked her for sharing. They were the first peoples to settle on the shores of the Hell's Sea, the instructor began as he shaped his black hair with his hands in nervous urgency, while enumerating Odin's faintly mythical history. Every account preceding 3,000 years before, he explained, was reliably third-hand, and were inherited as oral tradition. Structures and texts that survived provided little in the salient facts concerning the gaps in its ledgers. Many chroniclers speculate the nation suffered tyrants that destroyed the records of their impropriety, and their disgraceful facilitators were quite thorough in the process. It is a dangerous place if you are not prepared to live there. Many of the settlements rely on hunting and fishing for food, both of which you are keenly aware can be difficult, depending on the game you pursue and your competition. Ice bears and red killer whales haunt the shoreline for the same prey, and are often much more efficient in their carnage than any singular human. I myself have never done any hunting or fishing, but I'm sure some of you have. Rats, Vodstock answered, as if prompted, to which Harker turned to him. Ah, they must be difficult to catch. Vodstock shrugged, as his rending of rodents was unrivaled by his peers, or, frankly, anyone aboard the ship. Charged with the preservation of stored dried goods on Khufu, their extermination was a brief but productive obsession, and was further impelled by his earning a regular wage for the task. The labor awarded him the impression he was an upstanding member of society, and his dignity and poverty inspired even the most beggarly to industry. The lecture remained unfinished, however, as Firo appeared and revealed a storm was certain to strike soon, and thus their martial training should proceed immediately. Harker unleashed his wards and directed them to the deck. They scrambled to the stairs in concord, gripping the hilt of a wooden sword dangling from the hand of the former knight. Once the weapons were distributed and his audience was captive, Firo unmasked his intent to nurture his self-doubt by telling the children a long and rehearsed tale about a fight he had won against 5 men trying to rob him in the countryside of Barad-dûr, pantomiming it for his audience with unwilling adversaries quite awkwardly. The kids pardoned his harmless conceit with generous smiles and nods. Remilia jabbed Vodstock in the ribs playfully, and his body jolted at the sensation. Before any instruction to the contrary could be issued, the lot of them were swinging their swords at one another and ignoring Firo's feeble pleas to stop. The clacking of the wood drew an audience, and many other members of the crew provided guidance to their juniors. Sol and the former Wooloo knight held their contest at the bow of the ship, with the latter attacking her gently, but still relentlessly. Her inability to competently defend herself would have invoked impossible frustration in anyone else, but her patience with her own failures meant she could improve without the burden of uncertainty in a potential already achieved. She grinned in place of feeling shame for applying her theory for violence to reality. She reckoned there was no alternative to patricide if she ever hoped to find peace, but peace eluded her even then, surrounded by the wilderness of the sea, and having already done the deed. Syrian had recovered from his melancholy following a few weeks on the water, and Sol was determined to toughen her brother emotionally so he might survive her loss should it ever come to that. Scene 6. The rain began suddenly, and was swollen by a strong southerly wind, pulling them into plump drops that doused the casualty of gravity and ensuring the crew's retreat indoors. The sails were furled as the ship braved an ocean in characteristic turmoil. Harker occupied himself by investigating the observation he made earlier about Darrow Bavair's proficiency in common. This surprise, however welcome it was, revealed a sinister truth about her past she may be reluctant to disclose in the presence of her peers. He was also concerned she may be challenged in her studies, and if she discovers his syllabus inadequate, then he is duty-bound to revise it for her sake. The instructor opted to take her aside and discuss the matter outright. Your common is advanced for someone who's only been practicing for a little over a month. Dara's face was long fixed to one expression, and this quality inspired a government official to spare her. When her family was tried and sentenced, she was interrogated by a former banker drafted into military service after losing his employment due to incompetence. His capacity for his current work was consistent with his history, but he gleaned from her limited testimony she was harmless, and if orphaned would likely perish anyway. He ordered her release, and 6 months later she was kidnapped and sold 3 times. Following each transaction, her new traffickers searched for a buyer seeking to torture her family by proxy for their crimes. Her continued survival, to her former prosecutors, was of no consequence, though, and so beyond her capacity to work and grow more slaves in her belly, she appeared to them an unprofitable venture. Dara was a curious creature, however, and did the unthinkable. She placed her trust in Harker, dispensing with all warranted reservations that informed her position, and stated plainly, "My parents taught me. They would bring home the books and parchments from the palaces, and I learned to read and write." He would not squander the opportunity to learn more about her, so he prolonged the exchange with a question. "In Khufu and common?" When she answered favorably to his guess, he inquired as to why she had said nothing before, assuming with an academic's tendency for insulated learning that her answer would be exceedingly complex. But she rejoined in the timbre of one seemingly surprised by her own admissions. "I wanted the other kids to like me." Harker noted he would refer to Sinmo's strength for consoling children, and changed the subject as he turned toward a bookshelf. "I take it you need something more challenging, then." She observed his hand hover over the text along the spines as he considered them. Every volume of history sported a provocative title she felt compelled to explore further. A smile, born of a wish granted, usurped the reigning and ceaseless apprehension hidden in her face, and Sinmo cheered silently upon witnessing her delight from afar. "I thought so. How about this?" he asked, deliberating no more, and revealing the cover, "The Taming of the Mini Aloris." This book has a cheeky title, as the people of the Mini Aloris are, of course, not to be tamed like beasts, but it contains a rich history of the islands, he explained, chuckling, as he contended with the unshakable impression she had become something of a colleague in all but name. Her gratitude was still childlike, in that it was brief. "You're quite welcome. Now, if you see the others struggling, perhaps you can guide them in their studies," Harker requested expectantly. She felt this was an agreeable arrangement, and imparted her consent through a lack of protest. The pages she studied glowed orange in the light of the fire, as the other children were sitting dispassionately, for they knew Harker would soon suffer them to learn arithmetic. But Romelia fashioned a line of questioning to distract him long enough to delay the lessons past lunch, when the material could be explored absent their burden of hunger. "Where are we going?" "We sail for the edge of the Hell's Sea, where Odin's fleet will be waiting for us." "I don't know what will happen once we get there," Harker explained, and finding his own ignorance on the matter troubling. His attention had been the hostage of his posterity, and he failed for over a month to inquire as to what purpose they make for the north. Sinmo ventured to explain without undermining his associate. "The captain will provide a report to the admiral and receive new orders, if that's what she wants. We may return to this side of the world one day, but I do not know. Khufu is quite a distance from the northern reaches where Odin resides, and the captain decides to where we sail. Since I've known her these last 13 years, it has been no other way." Harker recalled he had purchased a poorly finished world map in Khufu. He would be required to revise the boundaries of many countries, as it was obsolete in this respect, but for the present moment it would still serve a useful purpose. "I bought this in Khufu. This is where we are," he told them as he pointed near the middle of the map where Khufu lay, and he traced his finger along the center of the Midras Ocean to a continent called Herzamon, and nested near its center at the northern coast was the nation of Odin. "And that is where we're going." Romelia was perplexed, but cautiously optimistic, as his own inquiries in the matter had yielded an initial answer that delivered him to the brink of despair. Zengo estimated the journey would take 6 months, but likely more because, despite its name, the Ravensword could not fly, and no odyssey of such length would be devoid of hazards and setbacks. They were as inevitable as the sunrise, but the boy disclosed his ignorance by asserting, "That doesn't seem so far." Sinmo erupted with laughter, holding his belly as it rose and fell with his breath. Once the spell of levity had been broken, he showed him while gesturing at the map, "We have been using the westerly winds to sail with such speed these last few weeks, as we have been traveling east. Our journey here, you see, is to the northeast. Without the aid of these winds, it will take much longer to arrive in the hills than to leave it." "How much longer?" Harker repeated the question, unsatisfied with his compatriot's unclear response. "6 months, give or take," he announced, much to the displeasure of his audience. The groans and lamentations issued by them provoked only amusement from the veteran crew, and even the captain chuckled at their observed misfortune. "Enjoy the warmth while you can," Sinmo began, indulging his recreation for teasing the children and his partner. "You islanders have never experienced a proper winter in your young lives. That includes you." His gaze turned to Harker. "When we make for Port and Vorak," he pointed at an island a few hundred miles west of Odin, "you will use some of the wages you've earned to buy some clothes to survive the cold in the north. I suggest you get a couple of sizes too big, as all of you are still growing." "Will we see?" Vodstock had prepared mentally to address him in common, but failed to fully translate his words. He moved to ask his instructor something in Khufu, to which Harker replied after a pregnant pause. "I actually don't know the word for snow in Khufu." Sinmo knew there was no substitute for looking upon a landscape concealed by a thick white blanket, and spoke with deliberate mystery. "You have seen nothing like it, nor have you felt the climate necessary to produce such weather on your skin. The wind can burn your cheeks, and your hands and feet will turn black if you're exposed for too long. The cold will feel as if the sun has abandoned us, and no hearth lit could survive that domain. But the Odinites have done just so." He studied the faces of his pupils to discern if alarm had thoroughly possessed them before he exposed their futures further. "The snow will fall so densely that you cannot see 5 feet in front of you. We will be sailing into a curtain of it, hoping also to navigate through the glaciers without colliding with them. It is very dangerous." The children repeated glacier, as it seemed to elude their vocabulary, but fascinate them all the same. "The closer we get to Herzamon, the safer it will become. There are no pirates or slavers in the Hell Sea, and they are scarce for 1,000 miles in every direction in the waters neighboring it. For the next month or so, though, it is likely we will run into some trouble, or perhaps the captain will go looking for it." Rocco appeared on the stairs, and the sound of his weighty footsteps drew their attention. "Get a move on, we got work to do." The lot of them obliged and deserted the makeshift classroom. The days passed without event, and the only thing novel seemed to be whatever Harker wanted to teach them. But after a while, even this failed to evoke a sense of contentment. Their restlessness was reflected by the ocean, in that it was endless, and it often left a bad taste in their mouths. Until one day, nearly 3 weeks into their pilgrimage, Vodstock was dangling his legs on the side of the ship and peering out over the water when he noticed a dot on the horizon. He stared at it, and the dot appeared to be moving with them. He paused as he watched but quickly looked around for an authority. A few moments later, before a crew member named Zango appeared with a casual demeanor, and neglecting to begin her watch by surveying the view around them. Vodstock tapped her arm and was briefly preoccupied with her tattoos when she spoke with the smoke pipe clenched between her teeth. "What is it, little one?" Vodstock gestured towards the moving dot in the distance as Zango drew tobacco smoke into her lungs and exhaled. The reprieve from anxiety that normally accompanied this ritual was denied when she realized the merits of his concern. She squinted and approached the edge of the ship, retrieving a small telescope from her red waistband. She stared at the object a moment before ordering him. "I can't make it out." "Go get Rocco." The boy would imperfectly comprehend what was about to occur, as he informed his superior he was requested on the deck by Zango. When the first mate arrived, he relieved her of the telescope and said, "It's definitely a ship on our heading. They'll intercept us in 10 minutes, I'll tell the captain." Valara detected tension in their voices from her quarters and approached them as they gazed at the growing shadow. "Captain, it looks like maybe we got a fight," Rocco revealed as he offered the telescope. She refused it, though, and employed her own, which had the effect of dwarfing those in use by her crew. After determining the flag flown by the ship in question was an enemy, she was definite with her first mate. "Everyone to general quarters." The second in command complied and raised the alarm. "Aye, Captain." The hanging bell was rung, and it electrified the 90 or so crew members into action. "General quarters," he shouted over it again as he managed the chaos of preparing for battle. The adults scrambled around the children, arming themselves and loading the cannons as the ship came ever closer. Harker and Sinmo guided their wards below deck, and all but the old man was oblivious to the danger they were in. Minutes would go by, and the stamping of the crew's feet on the wood ceased, and a silence chewed their courage. They sat at their stations with sweat dripping as the gap between the ships closed. No other sound proceeded for a time until it was shattered suddenly by a piercing cry. "They're turning!" Sinmo clapped his hands to his head and prayed they would comply. "Cover your ears!" The children and Harker did as he instructed, and only a moment later, a booming barrage shook their vessel, followed by a residual trembling in their bodies as they lay upon the floor. They could hear the enemy ship's hull yield to their munitions from far off, but the enemy returned fire with cannons aimed at the Odinites' broadside. A massive hole exploded on the starboard side of the Volsung ship, and the children came to know another great darkness. They lay in the wreckage of the hole with the sun now shining through. Vodstock felt the warmth running down his leg and panicked, but realized upon inspection it was blood pooling on the ground around him. The lot that were able stood, as Harker and Sinmo swiftly examined the children for injuries. Remelia, however, remained laying as his body convulsed. When he was revealed at last, they beheld a shard of wood had deeply pierced his throat. Vodstock sank to his side in brutal grief and howled hysterically at the sight of the blood, and his comrade incapable of drawing breath. Those who became dearest to him petted his hair as blood pulsed from the wound. His eyes confessed his ruin was known to him, and he begged wordlessly and hopelessly as he clutched Vodstock by the arm, gripping tightly until his fingers loosened, and he lay still. See you in chapter 5.